Hi, welcome to Conservative Voices Talking Points. We are live from Studio 5 here on the campus of Mudd Advertising in beautiful Cedar Falls. I'd like to welcome you all, welcome our audience, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'll start right here to my right. Gentry Collins, Larry Elder, Eric Branstad, and Rob Mudd. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. Let's jump right in. Gentry, I'm going to point this one at you, and then we're going to open up the conversation. We've got something in the backdrop here that says first in the nation, first in the world. I know you've got a very strong take on both American history, what that means to us, and the progression we've seen since America was founded. Give us your take on that, please, sir.
Yeah, as you know, Iowa has the great privilege of being the first in the nation state to select a presidential nominee. And we've always taken that very seriously. And I think it's more important today than it's been in living memory. Right? There's a real question now about whether we're going to have another American century. And Larry, I'll ask you this question. You know, in the first American century, a lot of Americans don't know this, but in the first American century, we almost tripled global human life expectancy. Right? We had about 6,000 years of written, recorded human history. And what you find when you study is that at every time up until the American century, we lost more of our poor around the world to diseases of deprivation, starvation, and so forth. Right. And today, after one single American century, instead of life expectancy of 30 around the world, which is what it was in 1900, life expectancy now in the 70s, and we'll lose more people to diabetes and obesity and so forth, diseases of excess, than to disease of deprivation. One hell of an accomplishment, an American century that really lifted people up in a way that no other system ever has. And yet, our young people aren't following down that pathway. We've got a generational battle on our hands for the idea that we ought to have another American century. And I wonder, what is it, Larry, you think that the next president can do to secure another American century and all the human flourishing that comes with it?
I'm happy you started out with a nice soft one. I think our problem is our educational system. Our kids are frankly clueless about how great America is, what we've done, what we've contributed to the world. Through our Industrial Revolution, made life easier, made life less stressful, made energy more efficient. You know, we have a generation of kids who believe that America is an imperialist nation. We're not. That believes America is a racist nation. We're not. A sexist nation. We're not. We're the least racist, least sexist nation in the history of the world, where you could realize your potential in one generation to a greater extent than any other country in history, and our young people just don't know it. They think of the founding fathers as racist, white men who owned slaves. They don't realize that slavery was unfortunately the rule rather than the exception for almost all of human history. It was the West and Western values that began to reject it. We fought a war over its abolition. I think a lot of young people are simply completely, totally aware of that. We're in a country where, according to the National Educational, what's called the Nation's Report Card, 85% of black 8th graders, these are 13-year-old black kids, can neither read nor do math at grade level. 85%. Almost half of them can't do basic reading, which means a large percentage of 13-year-old youth in America are almost functionally illiterate, and they know very, very little. And don't just take my word for it. During the Obama administration, he had a national security advisor named Ben Rhodes. And Ben Rhodes basically bragged that he pushed this phony narrative that the reason we wanted the Iran deal is because there's this clash between the hardliner Ayatollahs and the moderate Ayatollahs. Ha ha ha, he said to the New York Times after the deal went through, there's no such thing as a moderate Ayatollah. The reason he said we were able to get that through is because, and I'm quoting him, the average person writing about foreign affairs is 27 years old and they literally know nothing, end of quote. I didn't say that, he said that. So we're raising a nation of people that don't appreciate Judeo-Christian values, don't appreciate patriotism, don't appreciate how we change the world through entrepreneurship, and as a result, they are really quite cool. I'm very, very worried about the country. One more quick thing. There are 13 public high schools in Baltimore, 13. Gentry, where 0% of the kids can do math at grade level, 0. And another half a dozen, only 1% can. They're all in the inner city, meaning half of the public high schools in Baltimore are schools where either 0% or only 1% of the kids can do math at grade level. Only 1 in 20 kid in government schools in Chicago, I prefer the term government schools to public schools, only 1 in 20 can do math at grade level. That's a recipe for disaster. If we don't have a literate population, we cannot keep our republic.
Talk to us for a minute about what presidential leadership can do about those problems. How does a president put the country back on the right track?
I believe that the primary reason that Barack Obama, who won with 52% of the vote, walked into the Oval Office the third week of January with 70% approval, Henry. Think about that. Can you imagine Donald Trump hitting 70%?
No.
He walked in the Oval Office before he'd signed any executive order, had not done anything, and he was at 70%. Why? Not because all the people who didn't vote for him suddenly said, you know what, I think I want Obamacare. I think I want my capital gains taxes raised. They thought that at the very least, he put the notion to rest that America is systemically racist. And every time he had a chance to be the guy they thought they hired, he went the wrong way. From the Cambridge police acted stupidly, to if I had a son, he looked like Trayvon, to racism is in America's DNA. I mean, think about that. The first time Gallup asked white Americans if they'd vote for a president was in the 50s. And the percentage that said yes was in the 30s. Now only 4% of whites say they would not vote for somebody who was black if they thought he or she was qualified. Obama embraced Black Lives Matter. The number one social problem in America is the large number of kids enter the world without a father in the home married to the mother. 70% in the black community, half of Hispanic kids, 25% of white kids, which was the same percentage as was the case with blacks back in 1965. Now 40% of all kids in America enter the world without a father married to the mother. I mentioned that in connection with Black Lives Matter because on their website, until we began to complain about it, they literally attacked the nuclear family as a European construct. They embrace Karl Marx, who is an atheist who wanted to dethrone God and who did not believe in capitalism, did not believe in entrepreneurship. So all the things that allow black people to keep moving forward, even after slavery. We're talking about Jim Crow, KKK. In 1940, 87% of blacks lived under the poverty line. 20 years later, 1960, 47% did. That's a 40-point drop in 20 years. The greatest 20-year period of economic expansion for blacks in American history. Why? It was rare for a black kid to be born without a father in the home. A strong belief in Judeo-Christian values, a strong belief in entrepreneurship, and even after America wasn't living up to its ideals, a strong belief in patriotism. All of that is under assault right now by organizations like Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, is supported by almost 80% of black people, including Barack Obama. So one of the things I can do is put a real knife into the notion that America is systemically racist. And we need to get back to believing in ourselves, believing in entrepreneurship and hard work and self-improvement.
Amen.
Hey, perfect. Next topic, I'm gonna shift gears.
Did I pass the inspection?
Yes, perfectly. Yes, sir. Eric, I'm gonna direct this to you. Speak a little bit about your experience in government, the bloated government. I'm gonna use some air quotes here. ABC agencies, whether that be the EPA or others, that just have these non-elected officials that seem to have a lot of power in the country. Could you give us a little bit of your experience in that?
Well, prime example, when I was the beachhead lead at the Department of Commerce during the transition, and on January 20th. And now what that means is that I was tasked with bringing in being at the Department of Commerce on day one, on January 20th at 12:01 p.m., being the first political appointee into the building. And I was tasked with bringing basically about 164 political appointees at different levels within the department, bringing them in, getting them hired, getting them through the process. I found out the Department of Commerce is 47,000 employees, the department itself. And after spending a year there, I was convinced that if we lost 46,000 of those employees, I don't think we would notice anything different. I don't think the world would either. So I've seen how big government is and how hard it is to in fact, it's impossible to let anyone go from the federal government. One of those jobs as beachhead lead right from the very beginning, being I was the political appointee, and they would come in and ask me about, they were asking me about court cases and some judgments and whether we should settle, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I couldn't believe when they told me too that the U.S. government, when they're sued in D.C., they lose something like 78% of the time. The juries just go against the government. So with all that, what are some ways and some thoughts on how big government is and how maybe we can shrink it?
Is that to me?
That's to you.
Well, the problem is government gets bigger whether it's Republicans running it or Democrats. I recall when Ronald Reagan ran in 1980, he ran with the platform promise of shutting down the Department of Education. When he left, it was bigger than it was before. I got fact-checked one time when I'm on Fox News. I did Fox and Friends in the morning. And you do Fox and Friends in the morning, you get fact-checked. And I said that government in 1900 at all three levels took less than 10% from the American people. And right now it takes about 32%. And if you add a cost to a mandate, as when you're running a ethanol factory and they're telling you need to buy something that you don't think you need to buy, that's a cost. So you put a value of that. Government right now takes about almost half from the American people. I get a phone call from one of these left-wing fact-check organizations. All of them are left-wing. And said, government in 1900 took less than 10% of the American people in federal, state, and local? I said, that's right. I gave them a source. Right now you said it takes 32%. I gave them a source. And you claim that if you figure out the cost of mandates, it's now 50%. I gave them several sources. So I wrote a piece in the newspaper and said, Elder half right. On the first one, Elder claims that in 1900 government took less than 10%, actually it was 9% at all three levels. It said Elder was right. And that was the one, by the way, they were the most gobsmacked about. Secondly, Elder now says right now they take 32%. Elder's right. But when it comes to the cost of mandates, that's subjective. Because if you are required to buy something, it adds value to your business, then you really can't call it a cost because it gave you an advantage. And I was so ticked off, I called the two people who wrote the article, and to their credit, they came on my radio show. And I said, I made 3 points. First one, Elder, you said I was right. They said, yeah, about the 1900 thing? Yeah. Second one, you said I was right about what it takes now. He said, you're right. Third, you said I was wrong because it's subjective. The Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, I gave them an economist named Leo Haney at UCLA, all of whom said, if anything, Elder understated it. But they said, well, that's subjective. I said, okay, let's assume I'm wrong about that. How come I'm not 2/3 right instead of just half right? That's fuzzy math. And my point is, that's how big government has gotten. When Reagan left, one of his first Office of Management and Budget guys, his name was David Stockman, wrote a book called The Triumph of American Politics, because he was a young Turk. Reagan had all these 30-year-old and 40-year-olds coming in there, going to reduce government, get it down to the size that the founding fathers wanted. Article 1, Section 8 outlines a handful of duties, responsibilities, obligations of the federal government, leaving everything else to the states and to the people. We're going to get it right back down to that. And after every kind of bureaucrat or agency was on the chopping block, in come a bunch of consultants, a bunch of lobbyists, and next thing you know, it got spared. And so government did not shrink under Ronald Reagan. We need an amendment that fixes spending to a certain percentage of GDP, with exceptions for war and for natural disaster. Otherwise, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. The only reason our currency remains as strong as it is because other countries are worse. All the spending, all the inflation, all that is reckless, reckless, reckless spending. So much of what we're doing, the founding fathers never intended. They'd be spinning in their graves to see a government this large. So the only way I can see restraining spending for real is to do an amendment, because half of all the spending is through the so-called entitlements. I say so-called because we make a contribution to them, not really fair to call them entitlements. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And then you throw in interest on the debt and national security, you're talking about a sliver that's so-called discretionary spending. So until and unless we restrain spending by putting a handcuff on both parties, it's going to keep growing.
There's a look done by the Competitive Enterprise Institute at the growth in rules over time.
Right.
And what's interesting, I like to look at it from 1994 until today, because in 1994, you had the Republican Revolution, as you'll remember, right? The Republicans take the House for the first time in four decades. And a couple of years later, Bill Clinton sort of joins the club, signs a bunch of the points in the contract with America, declares the end of the era of big government.
Over.
Right. At that time, there were 9,200 federal rules on the books that have the force of law. And I start there because that's a time when both major parties agreed we had too many. We had 9,200, we had too many. The last official count was from 2021. We had 111,000 federal rules. Right? There's not a year under a Republican or a Democratic president where you had less than 3,000 federal rules added to the books for a period of 3 decades?
Yep.
3 decades. So there's an idea floating around in Congress now called the REINS Act, and I don't know if you've looked at this or not, but the REINS Act would turn the current system around. So currently, presidential administration can propose a new rule, go through the process, it becomes a rule unless it's challenged in the courts. Congress can take it up, but of course in a closely divided Congress, they rarely use their authority. So the REINS Act would turn that around and say that if a rule has I think it's $100 million impact on the economy, that it would have to be approved by Congress as a way to rein in the growth of federal regulations. Is that the kind of approach you might think about supporting?
Where do I sign? You know, there's been one president, one administration where government actually was smaller than when the president entered. Taxes had gone down, spending had gone down. It was Calvin Coolidge. Outside of that, every other president, things have gotten bigger than before. I recall that not Jimmy Carter, but 1972 presidential candidate, George McGovern, thank you. I don't think anybody was more left-wing than McGovern until then as a standard bearer of any party. And he lost, got crushed. When his Senate tenure was over, he started a little bed and breakfast in Connecticut. It was his lifelong dream. He had been traveling all around giving speeches at colleges, so he used all the money and put it into the bed and breakfast, and he went bust. And he wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal. He said, I only wish I had run a business before I went into politics. I would have realized things like minimum wage and all these regulations add cost to a business. And therefore, they already run on thin margins. You can't make any money. Well, duh.
And they hurt the small guys the worst.
Of course.
Right?
And the mom and poppers, these are the ones that people on the left claim they care about. One of the reasons I ran for governor in California, Gentry, was because of the way Gavin Newsom shut down our state. 1/3 of all restaurants went bankrupt. And most of those were mom and poppers owned by black and brown people, the very people that people on the left purport to care about.
Right, right. I had a chance to be at a major trade association in this country doing work supporting free enterprise. And their challenge was that their very largest members wanted to embrace more regulation, and their small members wanted to push back on it. Well, the reason the big ones wanted to embrace it is not because it was good for them, but because it was so bad for the little guys, right, that it would put their competitors out of business.
That's right.
An extraordinary overreach in federal government.
Yeah, people don't realize that when you are a big organization, all of a sudden, it's amazing how statish you become because you block out new competitors.
Right.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not because they want to advance capitalism. It's because they want to crush anybody else coming in new.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. Larry, we've got several people on the panel that are regular here that are involved in media. None as extensive as you.
My condolences.
Well, and it varies from whether it's news, media, or retail media, or political media. But you've got some chops, so I'd like to pick your brain on one thing in particular. Everybody kind of, I think, realizes there is a bias to media, but
just a little.
But can you give us a little bit of a timeline of where we were? Maybe the internet had a lot to do with this, right? Instant, at your fingertips information versus waiting for the nightly news, for example. But not only where the biases come from, but in general the acceptance of this bias, given as opinion, given as anything other than fact, right?
Right. We could talk for hours about the liberal bias in the media, and it is cancer. Maybe someday they'll develop a vaccine for it, but it is just stifling debate. We found out from the Twitter files that any kind of dissent over whether or not the lockdowns were bad got crushed. Any kind of dissent over whether or not mask and mandates were bad got crushed. People that raised objections, these were esteemed epidemiologists, had their Twitter files shut down or restricted or shadow banned in some sort of way. And as a result, the whole debate about whether or not we should have responded to this very serious public emergency the way we did was completely shut down. And as a result, I think many lives were lost unnecessarily. Depression went up, homicides went up, suicides went up, domestic violence went up, kids lost a whole year of education, and our educational system was no great shakes before that. That whole debate was stifled. We also know that the FBI collaborated with the big tech outlets, and the media happily went along with it in suppressing the Hunter Biden story. That alone would have ensured that Donald Trump had gotten reelected. The Washington Post and the New York Times are arguably the most important news organs in America. The New York Times has not endorsed a Republican for president since 1956. So,
is that Eisenhower?
Jimmy Carter, yeah. Jimmy Carter over Reagan? Michael Dukakis over George Herbert Walker Bush? Yes. The Washington Post has never in its history endorsed a Republican for president. So you have people getting their news now from Yahoo News, from their Twitter feed, all of which are engineered to restrict conservative content, conservative views, and as a result, people are in these educational silos and they just literally know nothing.
How did you build the followership that you built over the years? Because it's extraordinary.
Well, it should be bigger than it is. Without, I mean, and I don't mean that in a sarcastic way. The reason I know that is because after Elon Musk bought Twitter, my Twitter account suddenly exploded. I used to get a few hundred a week, and I began getting a couple thousand a day. It's tailed off a little bit, and everybody I know who's conservative had the same reaction. So it's clear that for years, what I was writing and doing has been suppressed. I write a column once a week, and I've been doing so since April of 1998. That's 1,200 columns, and the distribution of those columns is not nearly as wide as it ought to be if it weren't for the fact that I'm being restricted. I live in Los Angeles, born and raised. My father used to clean toilets. I went to an inner city school. I'm, by any stretch of the imagination, a success story, and LA Times loves to write about people from the city and what they're doing, writers, dancers, what have you. They've never carried any one of my columns. The LA Daily News, which is the second largest newspaper in LA, carries, but the difference between the Times and LA Daily News is like this. The Orange County Register does, but the LA Times never did. And because of my views. I refute the narrative that America is systemically racist, that I'm owed reparations, that inequities are because of Jim Crow and racism, and as a result, I am a bigger threat than a white conservative would be. When I ran for governor, one of the columnists, whose initials are Erica D. Smith, oops, wrote, and this is headline, Larry Elder is the black face of white supremacy, subheadline, you've been warned.
I remember that.
And when my race was over, I went back to radio to finish out my contract, and I invited her on my show. And of course, she wouldn't come on. One other little thing about restricting things, probably the most popular and meaningful magazine almost all my life for the black community is a magazine called Ebony. It comes out once a month. It still comes out, but it's not nearly as powerful as what I think it got sold and doesn't have the same kind of clout that it once did. But for a time, if you were in a black household in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a copy of Ebony on the corner table. And every year they had a feature called the 100 most influential black people in America. And every year missing were Clarence Thomas. By definition, one of 9 members of the Supreme Court is influential, not in there. Walter Williams. Walter Williams is an economist. I know you know him. He just died a couple years ago. He had about a newspaper column that had about 100, syndicated column that was in about 120 outlets. He is, to my knowledge, the first and only black chair of an econ department of a non-historically black college. Not in there. Thomas Sowell, who's written about 40 books, he's still with us. And David Mamet, the playwright, who used to be a liberal, credits Donald Trump with turning him from his word, a brain-dead liberal. He referred to, did I say Donald Trump?
You said Donald Trump, yes.
I can't believe I said that. jet lag. He credits Thomas Sowell with turning him from being a brain-dead liberal. And he referred to Thomas Sowell as America's greatest living philosopher. Not historian, although he is, not economist, although he is, philosopher. Most black people don't even know who he is.
And still writing, by the way. He's got a new book coming out, I think this fall.
He does,
yes.
does. One more quick thing about just this abject ignorance because of the way things are suppressed. There's a narrative that Black Lives Matter pushed that the police are engaging in systemic racism. That's why we had 4 months of protest, 30 people killed, 2,000 people injured, a couple $2 billion worth of damage during the summer months of 2020. All because of this phony narration that whatever happened to George Floyd by Derek Chauvin was because of George Floyd's race. Recall that the lead prosecutor was a black man. He never argued that what Derek Chauvin did, he did because of George Floyd's race. He took pains in his opening statement to say, not every officer is on trial. Police in general are not on trial. They do a good job. Most of them, the Minneapolis PD is not on trial. They do a good job. Most of them, this individual is on trial. And Derek Chauvin was never charged with a hate crime. Yet 4 months of protest in the streets, led by Black Lives Matter, based on the assertion that what happened to George Floyd was because of his race. There's a magazine online called policemag.com. They've talked about a poll. People that self-described as very liberal were asked how many unarmed black men did the police kill in 2019. 1,000 of self-described very liberal people thought the police killed 1,000 unarmed black men in 2019. 8% thought the police killed 10,000. What you ask, do just regular liberal people think? Well, of those who self-described as liberal, 39% thought the police killed 1,000 unarmed black men in 2019. 5% thought they killed 10,000. The answer, according to the Washington Post database, 12. Talk about a gap between the reality and what you think, and that drives all sorts of things. Taxes as well. I'm at a party once, and then I'll shut up. I might. I'm at a party once. A buddy of mine was celebrating his 60th birthday. It's quite a while ago. He's a Vietnam vet, and a bunch of people were at a party, and I assumed everybody kind of thought like we thought. And I hear this woman next to me. She's complaining that rich people don't pay any taxes. And I thought she was joking at first. And she said it again. I realized she wasn't joking. I said, excuse me, I'm part of the so-called rich, if you define rich as making above $300,000, which is not really rich in California, but I said, I have my 1040 in my car, you want to see it? She goes, no. I said, let me ask you something. Of the federal income taxes, what percentage of all the federal income taxes do you think are paid by the top 1%? And she said, oh, 1%, maybe 2%. And I had this incredible look on my face of astonishment, and I thought she was going to say, what's the answer? She never did. She didn't want to know, but she knew she was wrong. The answer is the top 1% pay 40% of the federal income taxes while making 20% of the nation's income. So you can make an argument that rich people are overtaxed, but she had no idea. So when you think rich people are only paying 1%, why not vote for the party to raise taxes since you don't believe people are, quote, paying their fair share? And that's the rhetoric you hear over and over again from everybody from Bill Clinton to Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden. The rich people aren't paying their fair share. It is nonsense. America is overtaxed. Hardworking people are overtaxed. The government is too big. We spend too much. We're doing things that could be done better, more efficiently, and more cheaply by the private sector.
So outside of going to your website, reading your columns, and listening to your show, what would be your recommendation on finding, let's call it non-biased or unbiased, actual news?
Well, I would send people to Prager University. It's designed for people with a short attention span, which is increasingly the case in America. You've got 5-minute videos on virtually every topic under the sun, whether about civil war, about taxes, about spending, about racism, about foreign policy, you name it, it's up there. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful source. Excellent,
excellent. Rob, I'm gonna come to you, because I know this really hits home dealing with automotive, and then Larry would like you to respond to Rob as well, but in a brief summation, give us kind of your take on the impact of, well, what we, I think, consider legitimately our biggest threat, China, both in economic stance in America, and particularly we're in Iowa, right? They own a lot of Iowa farmland. So just give us some of the snippets, and then we'll refer to Mr. Elder to give us his take.
Well, first, thank you for being here, Larry. It's a pleasure, honor to have you join our crowd here. Mudd Advertising works in the automotive space. So as you can imagine, we're pretty tuned into what goes on globally in the States when it comes to cars. And back in 2012, I was in Beijing when word came, it was November, that Obama had killed the pipeline, natural gas pipeline, from the United States to China. And then a month later, they hook up with the Russians. One of my partners over there, I said, why is the big push for electric vehicles here? Well, because of the smog and so forth. So how do they make electricity? They burn coal. So they burn black coal so they can save on emissions. So it never made sense, ever made sense. Well, that's been going on, that motive has been going on, since 2012. And now it's reached our shores, and it's dangerous, it's extremely dangerous. I believe that we're giving the Chinese what Henry Ford did for America at the turn of the century. That's what they want to do. What would you do? What do you think the solutions are in dealing with the Chinese? Because if they're looking at you, they're lying to you. Not all Chinese people, just people associated with the CCP.
Right. It's one of the biggest Trojan horses in American history.
Yeah.
I work right now for Epoch Times. Epoch Times is a newspaper that was started by Chinese, and their goal was to bring attention to what's going on in communist China and to literally bring down the regime. Mm-hmm. That's their modest goal. China has infiltrated itself all over American economy. whether it's from a bunch of foreign exchange students who come here. And by the way, every student who comes here has an obligation under the government to report back.
300,000 of them up every year.
To essentially be a spy.
Yeah.
They have an obligation. And American universities love them because they pay full rate. They don't get these discounts the way American kids do. This push for electric vehicles is all premised, of course, on the notion that climate change is a big peril to our civilization. If we don't take corrective action to wean ourselves from fossil fuels, we're all destined for destruction. I never believed it. When I ran for governor, I was called a climate change denier. I'm not a climate change denier. Climate is always changing. I'm a climate change alarmist denier. I believe whatever effects there are to the planet, whether it's rising water, we can deal with it. We have the technology and the intelligence to respond to it. But this business about force feeding everybody to own an EV, which is what Biden wants by a certain year, half of all the EVs, it's not as bad as California. The governor of California is mandating no sale of new gas-powered cars in the year 2035. If you look at everything that goes to make an EV, it takes fossil fuel generated electricity to make the damn thing, to transport it. Yeah. You look at what goes into the battery, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel. These are rare earth materials that either come from China or produced in China or produced or dug out of the ground in areas in the world controlled by China. So we're making China richer and richer, making us more and more dependent upon them. And in my opinion, if the goal is to reduce the carbon footprint, you look at everything that goes into making the EV, I don't think it does.
It doesn't.
And then you look at the exploitation of labor, child labor in the Republic of the Congo. The reason wealthy people stopped buying furs is because they didn't like the way the animals were being treated. But it's okay for us to look the other way while third world countries like the Republic of the Congo is using 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds to dig this stuff out of the ground. I don't get it. I really don't get it.
So
and last point, a few weeks ago, Gavin Newsom mandates that by the year 2035, no more sales of new gas-powered cars. 2 days later, he issued an energy alert, urging the 2.9% of EV owners in California not charge during peak hours because it taxes the energy grid. Hello?
Right.
Is this thing on?
Right. It's absurdity.
They're expensive. Poor people can't buy them as well as wealthy people do. The average owner of the EV in California is an upper class person for whom the car is a secondary car or a tertiary car. They use it for little errands, not for long hauling. It's not efficient, it's not cost efficient, it's not effective, and I don't believe it has a net plus for the environment that the proponents say they have. Other than that, I have no problem.
Well, that's a great answer. Thank you very much. The carbon engine today burns cleaner than it's ever had before.
You could close your garage door now and run it, and you won't die.
So they're trying to control our transportation, and they're also trying to control our kids, right? So we talked about media. What's your belief? I know what mine is, but they came to listen to you on TikTok and what it's doing to our youth.
It is. By the way, it's used very effectively by Joe Biden and the Democrats to get out their views because they know that young people are using TikTok. So, but that's not the primary reason. The primary reason that I object to it is because the Chinese are using it to mine data, to get data from us.
Right.
And I don't believe that we ought to allow it.
So if we know this, the people in government must know it too. So what's the end game? Well,
they don't care. I mean, the reason that the borders are open is because the left believes that if there are enough illegal aliens here, that at some point Republicans will come to the table and go, okay, all right. If you put back the Trump policies, the Remain in Mexico policy, stop, catch, and release, and the other things, Title 42 that Trump did to give us the most secure border in our history, if you put those back, we'll do a massive amnesty deal and we'll legalize millions of illegal aliens. That's what I believe they hope will happen. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If they thought illegals turn legal, turn citizens, turn voters would vote Republican, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So similarly, the reason that Democrats want 16-year-olds to start voting is because they believe they're going to vote Democrat. Otherwise, they wouldn't want to lower the vote like that. So they don't care. They are indoctrinating young people, make them more left-wing, make them more socialist, more Marxist, more anti-American, more big government, more regulation, more climate change, salting anybody who's pro-life as quote, telling women what to do with their body as opposed to believing that abortion is a sin, which is what I believe. That's what we've trained a whole generation of young Americans to believe. And then they become reporters, then become middle-level executives in corporations, and they run everything, which is why you're seeing all this wokeism everywhere. At Bud Light, Jack Daniels, all these people now are 30 and 40-year-olds, and they're executives, and they're bringing all their wokeism with them, and they're putting them in the private sector.
So this past week, Macron made a visit to talk to President Xi of China. We saw Vladimir Putin over there a couple months ago. The guy up north is making friends with them. The people down south, Central America, South America, we're surrounded. Do you think that's a fear that people should be thinking about?
Absolutely, they should be. Americans aren't really good at thinking about foreign policy. They're mostly thinking about kitchen table issues, which is quite understandable. But I believe that we are attacked on all different levels, from not just from China, although that's our biggest geopolitical foe. The Ayatollahs are this close to getting a nuclear bomb. You're finding North Korea still testing intercontinental ballistic missiles again, now that Trump is not there. They believe that Joe Biden can be rolled, and we are being threatened, attacked on every level, from our currency to artificial intelligence, military spending, on virtually every level. We are in jeopardy, and that's just external. And then internal, of course, is the thing we've been talking about, a whole generation of wokesters who are attacking virtually everything that made America great. It's a very serious time, which is why I'm considering running for president and trying to do something about it.
What makes us wake up?
Tell the truth. Ultimately, you have to depend on the logic and common sense of the American people. I believe that if the Titanic captain had seen the iceberg, he would have taken evasive action. There's an iceberg ahead. Yeah. We need to take evasive action. The only way to do that is to tell people the truth, what's going on.
Amen. Yeah. Agreed.
Larry, I've got one more topic before we start to wrap it up. You mentioned life. That's been a linchpin topic for some time, right? Decades. Mm-hmm. Recently, last year, with the Dobbs decision leading to Roe v. Wade and whatnot, right, there's been a lot of talk. We just yesterday in the state of Iowa, the Iowa Supreme Court saw the heartbeat bill for the first time in 5 years, since 2018. So it's hitting home, it's hitting nationally. I heard you loud and clear. Can you elaborate your personal beliefs, and then from a leadership standpoint, what America should encapsulate when it comes to life?
Well, I believe that there's nothing more important than life. I think that we as pro-lifers have a political disadvantage because of the pro-life position. Mike Huckabee was the only one I know of who said when Roe v. Wade got overturned, watch out about the politics of it. I think the decision was ridiculous. Abortion was always a state issue up until 1973, and for the most of our nation's history, it was a crime in all the states. Roe v. Wade nationalized an issue that should have been a state issue in the first place, and at that point, we were at each other's throats over the issue of abortion. It wasn't like that before. You look at the 1960 race between Nixon and Kennedy, abortion didn't even come up. And Roe v. Wade was just 13 years later because people knew it was an issue that was in the states and they fought it out on a state-by-state level. Roe v. Wade nationalized it, you take it away, and women believe now that that abortion is a right. It is not a right. How you change people's minds about that kind of issue, I don't know. When I ran for governor, I was called an abortion extremist. And I said this to a reporter who didn't print it, and it was never asked by my opponent. One of the good things about running for president is that you have a debate stage and they can't cut you off. At least for a while, you'll be able to make a paragraph. I said, ask my opponent, Gavin Newsom, at what point during a pregnancy does he believe it's gone so far that to terminate the pregnancy would be homicide? Ask him. They never did. It was asked, I believe, during the 2020 primaries, and the only one that gave a blunt answer to it that they really felt was Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders said, it's up to a woman. So a minute before birth, that's a position that the majority of pro-choicers reject. Yet that is how many people on the left feel. I was talking to this friend who is adamantly pro-abortion. I prefer the term pro-abortion than pro-choice. And she loves animals. And I said, you're walking down the street and your neighbor who has a beautiful collie, you hear the collie being whipped. What would you do? I'd call 911. Well, I happen to believe that abortion is a sin, but you expect me to be AWOL on the debate when you would intervene because somebody's being a dog? And I said, I have another question for you. Do you know who Dr. Kermit Gosnell is? She said, yes. I said, that's the doctor who's now behind bars, Philadelphia, for performing late-term abortions. Is he a political prisoner? Was he persecuted? Should he be set free? He was convicted of performing late-term abortions. Do you think that that was wrong? And she wouldn't answer the question. So I would put the argument back at them. Who is the extremist here? But convincing people of this is a matter of religion, matter of conscience, matter of morality, and unfortunately, a smaller percentage every year of Americans, especially young Americans, do not believe in God, do not believe in a Judeo-Christian God, and as a result, they don't see this issue the way you and I see it.
Yeah. And it's being politicized.
Yeah.
Just this last weekend, we saw Kamala Harris in Nashville, and she misquoted the Declaration of Independence by only including liberty and pursuit of happiness,
yeah,
just
yeah.
completely omitted life.
Yeah, and just as Nancy Pelosi said that Donald Trump will have the right to prove his innocence after being indicted by, I mean, honestly, if you don't get that right.
Very true. What we'd like to do is typically on each one of our shows we give each panelist closing remarks, but we're gonna hold off. We're gonna give you closing remarks, and that might leave us a few minutes here at the end to entertain some questions from the audience. But what I'd like to ask you, kind of open-ended, but tell us a little bit of how people can follow you, how people can get a hold of you, what your next. You don't have to give us intimate plans, but where are you going? What are you doing? How can we keep up with you?
Well, I have a political action committee called elderforamerica.com, a little something in the tip jar, and the reason I am considering running is because of the issues we talked about here today. The low-hanging fruit, obviously, are the borders. We talked about the government schools. We need to have school choice so the money follows the kid rather than the other way around. The spending, and we're no longer energy independent because of the attack on oil and gas and the attack on that whole industrial sector. The way we responded to the COVID pandemic by essentially locking down many states and depriving people of their jobs and depriving people of the ability to go to in-school education. But there are a couple of things I think I bring to the table, at least I hope I do, that maybe some of the other candidates don't. And we talked about it a little bit, and that is the ability to refute this notion that America is systemically racist. Every issue Democrats can turn into a racial issue, they do. And it's nonsense, and it's hurting the country. There's something called the George Floyd effect, or the Ferguson effect, and that's the phenomenon of cops pulling back from engaging in proactive policing. And there's a study done by a guy named Zach Kriegman. He used to be with Thomson Reuters until he did the study and he got fired. And he was a proponent of Black Lives Matter. And he found out in every one of these cities where there was a high-profile death, whether it was Freddie Gray in Baltimore or Michael Brown outside of St. Louis and Ferguson, the police pulled back, crime went up, homicides went up, and the people who were killed were the people who were black and brown people. He called them excess deaths. He documented thousands of excess deaths, people that would otherwise would be alive if it weren't for this lie that the police are systemically racist. This notion needs to be struck down. The idea that we need to have race-based preferences for diversity, equity, and inclusion for colleges and universities is doing a great deal of damage. Not just offending people who can't get in because they happen to be committing the sin of doing well on their SATs, like Asian American students at Harvard. It's also hurting the people that they expect to be beneficiaries. When you put somebody on a college campus and they can't keep up, they're more likely to flunk out, be angry that they flunked out, incur a bunch of student debt when they could have been matched at a less competitive school and things would have worked out just fine. So you're hurting the people that you claim that you care about through this whole business of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I got on a plane the other day and I saw a female pilot. I don't want to know about equity and diversion. I want to know, did she ace the flight examination? And same thing when someone's building a bridge. Don't you want to know whether or not the person can build a bridge? There are real world consequences to this. But the other thing I bring to the table is the recognition that the number one social problem in America is a large number of children who enter the world without a father in the home married to the mother. As I mentioned this, 70% of black kids enter the world today without a father in the home married to the mother. 50% of Hispanic kids do. 25% of white kids do, which was the same percentage of blacks in 1965. 40% all American kids enter the world today without a father in the home married to the mother. And forget about elder. Barack Obama said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Now the question is, how do we go from having 25% of black kids born outside of wedlock in 65 to 70% today? And the answer is the welfare state. We've incentivized women to marry the government, and we've incentivized men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. What do we do about it now? The analogy to me is AA. People I know who are in AA have what are called sponsors. These are people that they call when they're in trouble. There are a whole bunch of men who are angry, young men especially, angry because they don't have fathers. There are a bunch of people right now who are retired with a lot of time on their hands. They should be married up so that virtually every kid who doesn't have a father, who's full of rage and anger, has somebody that he or she can call to provide some sort of mentoring. Frederick Douglass said, "It is easier to build strong children than to prepare broken men." We have a lot of broken men in our country. I was watching the sheriff in Florida who gave that stirring press conference where he talked about it not being the gun. The 3 girls who were murdered by 3 other kids. And he said, I had to look in the eyes of the suspects' 2 mothers, and they were embarrassed. They were hurt. They were distraught over what their sons had done. And he didn't say father. He said mothers. And I didn't support the messenger of the Million Man March in 1974, but I supported the message. And he had 1 million men, black men, in Washington, D.C., and he talked about, Louis Farrakhan did, their obligations to their children and to the mothers of their children. And I called the police chief in Washington, D.C. next day, and I said, normally when you have a rally like this, crime goes up. He said, that's right. I said, I bet your crime didn't go up. He said, you're right, it went down. A bunch of people that otherwise might have been doing bad things were there on that mall, and they got the message. It didn't resonate, but at least the message was told. One of the biggest things a president has, of course, is the bully pulpit to talk about these kinds of things. It influences conversation all over America.
It does.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. We've got just a handful of minutes if you're okay with maybe taking a
No, I'm out of here. I'm gone.
All right.
It's Miller time.
I see a hand right there.
Yes, we've got a mic over here so the camera can hear.
Well, if you yell it out.
Okay. I love everything you've said. I'm very happy to be here to listen to what you have to say. It's been an amazing experience. I'm wondering if you can address how we at the local level can root out some of the same issues you've been talking about at the local level. We are finding out that this stuff has infiltrated at all different agencies, all different levels of government.
Everything, yeah.
And there are power structures in place that are protecting these people. If you have any comments or strategies at all for those of us who are working behind the scenes to try to influence some of this.
Yeah. I guess I have 2 responses. The first is all is not lost. As I said, ultimately, common sense, facts can alter how people think and how people behave. In San Francisco, where only 6% of the voters are registered Republicans, they recalled 3 school board members with almost 70% of the vote. These were school board members who spent their time during COVID deciding how to rename schools from racist people like Abraham Lincoln and Dianne Feinstein. And they spent their time on wokeism, and it ticked off all these left-wing parents, and they're now gone. At some point, it gets to the point where even people on the left say we have to do something about it. The most important prestigious public high school in Baltimore, in LA rather, is called Lowell High School. It always had an admissions test, and as a result, the student body was 60% Asian American, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and it wasn't sufficiently diverse, so a bunch of people protested, and they went to a lottery system. And a bunch of Asian American parents got together, filed a lawsuit, and had it overturned. There's a similarly prestigious high school in Virginia called Thomas Jefferson School of Science and Technology. Around 60% also of the student body Asian American. They went to another system like this to make it more diverse. And by the way, when they did it after the first year, a whole bunch of people who got in who would have been world beaters at another school were at the bottom of their class. And that also found a lawsuit, and they went back to where it was. So at some point you get so ridiculous that people do something and push back. But beyond that, I am proud to say that when I ran for governor, I had never run for anything before. I never thought I would. For 40 years, I'm criticizing politicians, not being one of them. But so many people approached me and convinced me that I should do something, and I felt I had a patriotic and a moral and a religious obligation to do it. And I got letters all over the country telling me, I know, Larry, you said you never run before. I'd always made jokes about it. And now I'm going to run for school board. Now I'm going to run for water board. Now I'm going to run for county commissioner. Now I'm going to run for supervisor. Get involved. If you don't get involved, nobody else will. And what people don't want to do is put their personal lives out. It requires a great deal of energy, and unless you're stealing, you're not making any money. And so that's why a lot of good people don't go into public service. But until good people do it, unless good people do it, our republic is doomed. You are obviously sharp. Get involved.
Excellent. We've got time for maybe one more question.
Or we can go a little long.
Well, the man says we
We
can go
own the
long.
stage.
Maybe we've got
We own the
time for
stage.
2 more questions.
I'm paying for this microphone.
And if you've got one, we've got a microphone here so that
I have one more.
a follow-up. Go right ahead.
Sure.
I'll bring it to you if that'd be better. Okay.
Could you please address the DE&I effect in corporate America and how to strategize as an employee that wants to succeed? Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a tough one because your paycheck is on the line here. They have all these sensitivity training things where you're taught about your privilege and your racism. Having worked in corporate America, I've seen these kinds of things, and they're obnoxious and they're offensive. When racism has never been a less important problem in America, it's never been a more important issue for the left. I always tell people to pick their spots. I get the same question regarding academia. You're in a class and the professor is a lefty and you think you're in an archaeology class. Next thing you know, they're talking about racism and systemic racism. It happens all the time. And if you raise your hand and you fight with the professor, it's a good chance that you're going to get downgraded as a result. So I tell people to pick their battles. We have a lot of power as consumers. The whole thing with Bud Light, using a transgender person, advocate in part of their ads. I know some people that work for Bud Light. They're not happy. They're losing money. As a result, the sales going down. Same thing with Jack Daniels, same thing. So as consumers, we have a lot of power to not participate with wokeism. I co-founded a bank called Old Glory Bank, along with John Rich and Dr. Ben Carson, because of all this wokeism on the part of banks, shutting down people who have bought rifles and shutting down accounts like the National Rifle Association. So if you are banking at one of these woke banks, and most of them now are woke, they won't lend to oil and gas, you have another option. It's called oldglorybank.com. So I'm trying to do something about it. We have to figure out our own means, our own options. One of the things Donald Trump did, of course, was with Truth Social, varying reports about how well it's doing, but the whole point was to provide a platform different from Twitter so that you could post stuff and have confidence it's not going to be shut down. So I don't know. If there's a group of people, so there's a critical mass in your company who feels the same way, maybe you can go to management and voice your concerns. There might even be a lawsuit that you could file. There's a lot of organizations, American Defending Freedom, that will represent people who have issues for free. You can go online and see some of them, but we have to fight back. We have to fight back.
Yes. Thank you. Any other questions?
I solved everything?
Yes, sir.
I'll ask a quick one. What's your favorite part of Iowa? What do you like the best about it?
I've been here now about half a dozen times in the last 6 months. One of the reasons I've gained 10 pounds and haven't been able to get rid of it is because of the Iowa State Fair. I love bacon. Bacon in a cup, bacon on a stick, pork chop on a stick, butter on a stick. No, I just love the people. My mother grew up on a farm in Huntsville, Alabama. My dad is from Athens, Georgia, and so I've always been comfortable in a rural area. I've always loved farming. I used to ask my grandfather if I could buy the farm someday. the people are just so down to earth. I think it's a marvelous place to have the first in the nation. I think the Democrats are making a mistake by moving it to South Carolina. I know that they say that the state is too white. Isn't it the same state that Obama won in 2008? How did that happen? I've gone to the Iowa State football game, the Cyclones.
Well, there's another one too.
Yeah, I heard about that. Well, you know, I went to Michigan, and so
Okay,
it's
well, then you know.
same league. It's just a great state with marvelous people, down to earth, friendly, and I always feel when I get off the plane, whether it's Des Moines or Cedar or Potawatomi. Took me a couple hours to pronounce that properly. I always feel there's a certain just makes you relax. And the reason for the Electoral College is because the Founding Fathers did not want rural areas to be ignored in favor of more populous areas. And so for all sorts of reasons, I think this is a marvelous place for there to be the first in the nation.
Very good.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Viewers, thank you for watching. Thank you. And special thanks to our panel, made up of our guest, Mr. Larry Elder. Thank you very much from Conservative Voices Talking Points, and from all of our panel. Thank you very much, Mr. Elder.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.